Jean Boase-Beier, and I'm going to be talking to Fred Beake. I am the translations editor for ARC Publications, based in Todmorden. That's a small poetry press, and I'm also a translator of poetry and an academic. So I'm Professor Emerita at the University of East Anglia. The person that I'm going to be talking to today is, as I've said, Fred Beake. Fred is a poet and translator. He's published his own poetry in several journals and book publications, including with Menard Press, Shearsman, Poetry Salzburg, and so on. And he's translated quite widely. So he's translated from quite a number of different languages. Desnos from French, Aristophanes from ancient Greek, Virgil from Latin, and it's Virgil that we're going to be talking about. So you can see that Fred is something of a, or you can guess that Fred is something of a classics scholar, and he does have a degree in classics from Bristol University. And the book that we're going to be talking about in a moment is this. I hope people can see this. It's always quite difficult to do this, but yeah, this is the chapbook we're going to be talking about, and its title is Virgil, Dreaming of an Ancient Country, Passages from the Georgics, translated from the Latin by Fred Beake. So Fred is going to read for 2 or 3 minutes, and then, or a few minutes, 2 or 3 poems, and then we are going to have a brief discussion. So do you want to go ahead, Fred, with your reading then?
Yes, okay. Well, one of the things that always fascinates me about the Georgics is how various they are in their tone. 1 minute you're in a fairly light mood, the next minute you're in rather a serious one, and the next minute you are in rather almost a romantic mood. Anyway, here is Virgil, which is most light-hearted, I think. This is his description of a cow from Book 3 of the Georgics. But whether you nourish your horses in hopes of Olympian triumphs, or bullocks to heave the plough mightily, pay special attention to the mother. The best cow has something of fierceness, and there is nothing pretty about her head. She has plenty of neck, her dewlaps hang from throat to knee, and her flanks cannot be too long. Everything should be on the big side, even her feet, and under twisting horns there should be shaggy ears, and there's nothing to worry about if she has odd spots and white ones at that, or throws off the yoke, or gets frisky with her horns. And if her face resembles a bull's, it is not a problem. Let her stand tall and swish her footprints with her long tails tip as she walks. The right age to bear calves, and therefore for mating, ceases before the 10th year, and begins when the cow is 4. For the rest, they are no good to breed, and too weak for ploughing. Anyhow, when the flocks are full of exuberance, loose the bulls. Be first to expose your cattle to Venus' will, and by breeding each with each, ensure your herd's continuance. And by way of total contrast, here is the rather lovely sketch from Book 4 of an old man that quite possibly Virgil actually knew. But now, by Obedia, I remember beneath the towers of the citadel, where the black waters of Galasus water the yellow crops. I have watched an old man, a Cilician. He ruled a few acres of abandoned land. The grass was no use for bullocks or cattle, and hopeless for vines. But here and there among the brambles he put in some vegetables, but also white lilies and vervain and some little poppies, and his seed and his soul was on a level with kings. Almost sentimental, you might say, but he was also very conscious of all the things that were going on in the world, the civil wars, that Rome had been through in the previous 100 years. And there is a passage at the end of Book 1 which is very much about that. The beasts are in flight, and a humbling shame has stricken the hearts of every man in every nation, as Jupiter hurtles down the great mountain, tossing blazing bolts, swelling of the gale and rain even thicker, so the woods and shores resound with moaning. Huge voice echoing out through the silence of sacred groves, and heard in terror by the multitude. Cattle speaking actual words. It was all quite horrible, and rivers halting in their courses, and earth bursting open. Temple statues, bronze and ivory alike, weep or sweat in their grief. And Eridanus, monarch of rivers, washed away woods, whirling insanely out of his course over all the flat land, took cattle and buyer alike. Threatening signs appear in entrails to the soothsayers. Blood does not cease to flow from the wells. Through the darkness, mighty cities resound with a sound howl of wolves. Never more lightning out of a clear sky, never more dire flaming of comets. And so Philippi came to see two Roman battle lines collide, and brother fighting brother with the same weaponry. But the gods above saw nothing improper when the great plains of Haemus and Emathia twice grew fat with our blood, and indeed, in time to come in those places when the farmer is busy with his curved plough, he will come across javelins half-consumed by molten rust, or one of his heavy hoes will strike an empty helmet, or he will upturn a burial and be struck by the size of the bones. So many wars throughout the world, and evil has so many faces. And as for the plough, it has no honor, the fields are waste, the cultivators removed, and the curve of the pruning hooks has become straight swords. There is action on the Euphrates, action in Germany, as treaties are broken between neighboring states and they fight. And holy Mars wreaks havoc throughout the world. It is just like when the 4-horse chariots burst out from the barriers, and they are lap to lap, and the driver finds that pulling the reins brings no response, and he lacks any control. But he is also very fond of the nicer sides of nature, shall we say. This finally is him describing a Roman spring at its best. And in spring, the land is eager and demands seed to bring forth life. Then Almighty Sky Father descends with fertilizing showers into the lap of his joyful mate. His whole might joins with her mighty frame to bring forth the new offspring. And then copses resound with melody, and bird with bird is mating. And at the due time, the herds are ready for love. The gravid fields are ready to produce, and the ploughlands loosen their breasts at the feel of soft breezes from the south. A gentle moisture abounds in all things, and grasses dare trust their safety to new suns.
Right, thank you for those readings. It's interesting poetry, isn't it? It's also quite, it seems very topical in many ways as well. But I just wondered if we could start our brief discussion by having you tell us a little bit about, well, not so much about Virgil, because I think people, well, people presumably listening now will have heard of Virgil, but I don't think they'll know very much about the Georgics, perhaps. Could you say a little bit about it, perhaps?
Well, the Georgics is his second big poem. It was written in the 30s BC as he himself was reacting to the changing world from the Republic into that of Augustus Caesar, or what was to be Augustus Caesar. He was actually Octavian at the time. I think there was a misapprehension which was quite widespread in the 18th century. The 18th century thought of it in terms of describing various forms of farming. John Philip Cider was famous, and it's little more than a description of how you make cider. But Virgil isn't really doing that. It's a sort of long, dreamy meditation about the Roman countryside, with the politics of the period drifting in and out. And he doesn't always aim to be realistic, and yet there is quite a lot that must have rung true with Roman farmers if they wished to read it. I wonder how many Roman farmers ever did read it. Though it was undoubtedly must have been widely read by villa owners and that sort of thing. I mean, the joy of the Georgics is that essentially it's dreamlike progress through a very Latin Roman landscape.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's what I remember when you first said this to us, and I first read this. That was exactly what struck me. You know, the kind of this kind of slightly dreamlike, the kind of slightly dreamlike nature of it. It's very I don't know what the word is. Very beguiling, I think, is the only word I can think of to read. You get caught up in it. It really is very, very interesting, but it's also quite, it's not just nostalgia, is it? As you said. How did you first come to translate it? This particular work, the Georgics.
Well, it's a very long story.
Well, we will perhaps not have all of it, but
well, it starts really with a Latin master at Tadcaster Grammar School who handed out a little green book of Georgics 4 to his lower sixth formers because we were going to do it in the upper sixth. And he said, have a good look, construe as much as you can. In fact, nobody but me took any notice of this, but I happened to be on holiday at Whitby with my parents, and I just got caught by the magic of the opening of the first 60 or so lines of Georgics 4. They really are magical. If you look at the Latin as opposed to various English translations, that is the quality that really takes you. Switch then to the early 70s, and I was translating quite a lot of Horace and Catullus, and I thought maybe I ought to try Georgics 4 since I'd liked it so much at A-level. And I ran into a brick wall, for want of a better description. It just did not seem to want to flow. And then years later, I did an adult degree at Bristol, and Professor Martindale in the first term threw a bit of the Georgics at us. And again, I found this magic, and I thought I've got to do the whole of this. He gave us extracts from all 4 books. And when I left Bristol, I started very slowly to try and translate it. And it struck me that the real problem was that Virgil tends to write in phrases that rather than, well, he does write in sentences, grammatically speaking, but his phrases are what dominate it. So I decided to try and find a method that would enable me to translate it by phrases. And I borrowed the idea of the variable foot from late William Carlos Williams, and it seemed suddenly to work. And it was a very slow process. I think I started in about 2006 or 2007, and I didn't finish till the other year. I was lucky to find a friend who had a hayloft out in the Devon countryside, which very roughly approximated to a lot of Virgil landscape. And I spent a lot of time there going at it very ferociously with 2 dictionaries, the old Everyman translation and 2 versions of the Latin text. But anyway, in the end, it happened. I think that's best way to put it. It was as much a happening as a translation, I think.
Yeah, it's very interesting to hear you talk about this and how you particularly how you went about it. And I mean, when you talk about the use of phrases and the importance of phrases, I mean, you obviously, well, I'm assuming you mean two things by that. You mean in a metrical sense, but you also mean in a syntactic sense, do you?
Yes, yeah.
You mean phrases in that sense, yeah. And so that those two things needed to come together. The way you dealt with the metrical patterns and the way you dealt with the syntax and the kind of thing that that he's actually saying from a grammatical point of view, they had to come together, presumably. Is that right? Is that the right kind of characterization?
Well, I've always found with translations that they either flow or they don't. This may seem odd, but that's how it's been with me all my life, and I've done a lot. And when they flow, you usually find that you've got a pattern that works, and it just carries you through. I mean, I suppose I'm a left side of the brain translator. I tend to sit down and let it flow, even though I'm using the dictionary quite a lot.
Yeah. I mean, I can see exactly what you mean, and it's a sort of a way of getting into the mindset of the original writer, isn't it? Because you sort of try to, I mean, obviously you can't know how Virgil wrote, but you try to do whatever it was he was doing in some appropriate form of English. It seems to me, reading it, it feels very, 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 very modern. How shall I put this? Did you try consciously to make it appeal to a modern reader, or did it just come out like that?
Well, I would always like what I translate to appeal to a modern reader, but essentially it came out like that. I didn't give great thought to diction or anything, but I did sort of give a lot of thought to particular phrases and how I could make them sound not too old-fashioned. I mean, I had Royd's old Everyman translation, which is very accurate but very Miltonic, from about 1900. And in a way, I was thinking to myself, how can I make it more up to date than he did? But anyway, yeah.
Yeah, and I mean that shows the importance sometimes of looking at other people's translations, doesn't it? Because some translators say, "Oh, I never look at." I mean, I'm never sure I believe it, but they do sometimes say, "I never look at anybody else's translation." But actually, part of the point with something which has been translated before is to get a sense of what you're doing yourself that is different from what's been done before. Because if it weren't different at all, there'd be little point in doing it. So, yeah, it's I can see exactly why you might look at something and say, no, I don't want it to be that old-fashioned. I mean, as I say, I think it reads in a way which is really quite modern. I mean, this again was one of the things that struck me from the beginning. We're kind of just about running out of time. It goes very quickly. Is there anything else you wanted to add about the way you translated it, or are you happy to just finish off with a? I know you wanted to read another little bit. Either just do that, or did you want to say anything else about the translation? I don't want to kind of cut you off if you did.
Well, nothing about the translation except that I think it was a bit of luck. I almost take no credit for it in a sense. But I'll finish by reading a bit about Orpheus losing Eurydice, which I think is marvelous, even more marvelous than the Latin, of course. But Orpheus has lost Eurydice, and he goes to try and collect her, and it all goes wrong, of course. He tried to soothe his love's sickness with the hollow lyre at the coming of day and the going down of day, through Taenarian jaws and the tall gates of Dis, and that grey grove that is black with terror, he went. He approaches the spirits of the dead and their terrible monarch, whose hearts have never been known to soften in the face of human prayer. but stirred by his chanting from the deepest depths of Erebus came slight shadows and images lacking any reality. They were like so many thousands of birds that hide themselves among the leaves, while evening or winter stirs a shower out of the mountains. Mothers and husbands and the heroes of great soul, whose bodily life is now done, and boys and girls that did not get to marry, and young men placed on the funeral pyre before their fathers' eyes, and round about them the black slime and misshaped reeds of Cocytus, and its unkindly marsh with its slow-moving waves binds them in, and ninefold sticks pouring round in shores that they remain. But they were bewildered, even the inhabitants of the house of death and the depths of Tartarus and the Furies with the dark blue snakes caught up in their hair. Cerberus stood there, threefold mouth gaping, and Ixion's wheel halted with the wind. Now his feet had avoided every accident. Eurydice had been returned. She was coming where you can feel the breezes of the sky above you. She followed behind, for Proserpine had laid down that command. Suddenly, madness took her incautious lover. It would have been forgiven if the dead knew how to forgive. He stopped. He looked back at his dear Eurydice as they came into the light of the earth. He had lost control of his mind. The result of his great labor flowed away as the agreement with the unremitting tyrant was broken. Threefold thunder was heard among the marshes of Avernus. She cried out, "Orpheus, what is it? What has condemned me to eternal misery? And you? What enormous madness is it? But the fates call me back with all their dreadful cruelty once again, and sleep shuts up eyes that are awash with tears. I am carried off. Huge darkness is all around me. I stretch out towards yours my hands that have lost their force. Alas, they will never be yours." So she said, and abruptly went from his eyes, like a flicker of smoke on the breeze in the other direction.
Thank you very much for that final reading. We will end on that note then, I think. So thank you, Fred, for reading to us so effectively and for talking about your work. And thank you to everybody who's listening to us. Bye.